April 5, 1944. The sky above the Bavarian Alps hangs cold and brittle, a cathedral of ice-blue silence stretching 30,000 feet above the snow-patched earth. At this altitude, the air is thin enough to make lungs burn, cold enough to freeze moisture on gun barrels in seconds. The contrails of German bomber formations etch white scars across the heavens. Messerschmitt Bf 110 and Junkers Ju-88 returning from a failed interdiction mission over Allied supply lines. Their crews are exhausted, fuel gauges edging toward red, nerves frayed from hours of high-altitude tension. They fly in tight defensive boxes, wingtip to wingtip, the way doctrine demands. Safety in numbers. Mutual protection. The Luftwaffe gospel, repeated in every briefing room from Berlin to occupied France. Then, through the static and breathing on the radio frequencies, a voice. Tight, clipped, edged with something the German pilots haven't heard much in their own transmissions lately: fear. Letztung, Amerikanischer Jäger. Sein Uhrhawk, 10 o'clock high. An American fighter. A singular. One aircraft against a formation of 18. The voice comes again, higher now, breaking protocol, breaking composure. Kommt zurück durch die Formation. He's coming back through the formation, and then silence. The kind that follows violence. To understand the terror in that radio call, you must first understand what the Luftwaffe expected of American fighter pilots in the spring of 1944. By this stage of the war, the strategic bombing campaign had settled into a brutal calculus. The United States Army Air Forces dispatched vast armadas of B-17s and B-24s deep into the Reich, bleeding men and machines in exchange for shattered factories and burning refineries. German fighter pilots, for all their losses, still held certain tactical certainties. American bombers flew in defensive formations that required coordination to break. American escort fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs primarily, operated in pairs or flights, adhering to the mutual support tactics drilled into every pilot at training fields back in the States. You covered your wingmen. Your wingmen covered you. No one went hunting alone. No one played the lone wolf. It wasn't courage the Americans lacked, it was permission. The doctrine was survival through cooperation, a reflection of the democracy that built the planes in the first place: committee decisions, collective safety, strength in unity. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, with its distinctive twin-boom design and tricycle landing gear, embodied this philosophy even in its engineering. It was a heavy fighter, designed as a long-range escort, built to shepherd bombers across hundreds of miles of hostile sky. Its twin Allison engines gave it endurance. Its centrally mounted armament, 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon clustered in the nose, offered devastating firepower without the convergence problems of wing-mounted guns. But it was not, by German estimation, a dogfighter. It was too big, too heavy, too reliant on altitude and speed rather than agility. Luftwaffe pilots who encountered P-38s in the early war years learned to respect their reach, but not to fear their maneuverability. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 or Focke-Wulf FW 190 could outturn a Lightning in a low-altitude knife fight. This was known. This was doctrine. What doctrine did not account for was a pilot who refused to fight the way the textbooks demanded. Second Lieutenant Jack Ilfrey of the 20th Fighter Group had been flying P-38s over Europe since the autumn of 1943. By April 1944, he had logged over 200 combat hours, more than half of them in the frigid, unforgiving skies above Germany. He was 23 years old, a Texan by birth, lean and quiet in the manner of men who learned early that talk was cheaper than action. In photographs from that period, he appears unremarkable, regulation haircut, standard issue leather jacket, eyes that give away nothing. But the flight logs tell a different story. Ilfrey had a peculiar habit, one that confounded his squadron mates and infuriated his commanding officers. He hunted alone. It wasn't recklessness, though it looked like it from the outside. Ilfrey understood something intuitive about aerial combat that the manuals struggled to articulate. Formations were predictable. Pairs were traceable. A lone fighter, flown by someone willing to abandon every convention of mutual support, became a ghost, impossible to track, impossible to anticipate, impossible to defend against using the standard playbook. He would orbit high above the bomber stream, thousands of feet above his assigned patrol zone, waiting, watching. And when a German formation revealed itself, too confident, too bunched together, too focused on the bombers below, he would dive. On April 5, he was flying top cover for a returning bomber group when he spotted them. A staggered formation of Bf-110 Zersterers, twin-engine heavy fighters bristling with cannon and machine guns, designed to shred bombers at range. 18 aircraft in a defensive wheel, their rear gunners alert, their flight leads experienced. Everything about their formation screamed, "We are not easy prey." Ilfrey didn't care. He rolled inverted and dove. The first pass was textbook, or rather, it was the textbook torn up and set on fire. Ilfrey came down through the formation's high flank at a near-vertical angle, speed building, past 400 miles per hour. The Lightning's airframe shuddering as compressibility effects clawed at the control surfaces. Most pilots would have fired a burst and pulled out, standard boom and zoom tactics. Ilfrey held the dive until the range closed to less than 200 yards, until he could see rivets on the nearest Bf-110 fuselage, until the German rear gunner's tracer rounds were arcing past his canopy close enough to smell the cordite. Then he fired. The P-38's nose-mounted guns were a blessing in this scenario. No convergence point to calculate, no need to adjust for parallax. Where the nose pointed, the bullets went. The concentrated stream of 50 caliber and 20mm shells walked up the Bf-110 spine, shattering the canopy, shredding hydraulic lines, detonating the starboard engine in a gout of black smoke and orange flame. The Zersterer nosed over, trailing fire, its crew already dead or dying. Ilfrey didn't pull up. He pulled through. This is what broke the German understanding. Standard doctrine said a diving attacker would pull out below the formation or roll away to the side, resetting for another pass. Ilfrey stayed inside the formation, using the altitude he'd bled off in the dive to pull a wrenching, high-G turn through the defensive box. His airspeed was still lethal, his energy state still dominant, and now he was inside the Germans' firing solution, too close for their gunners to track, moving faster than their flight leads could react. The P-38's twin-boom design, usually a liability in tight turns, suddenly became an asset. Its wide stance and centralized mass gave Ilfrey leverage, allowed him to haul the nose around in a way that would have torn the wings off a lighter airframe. The second kill came 11 seconds after the first. A Ju-88 bomber, slower and less maneuverable, tried to break right out of the formation. Ilfrey snapped his nose onto it mid-turn, fired a 2-second burst, and watched the bomber's port wing fold upward at an impossible angle, fuel streaming from ruptured tanks, the aircraft tumbling into a flat spin. The radio frequencies erupted. German voices overlapping, shouting, "Break left, break left." He's still in the formation, but breaking was exactly the wrong move. When a formation scatters, it loses its overlapping fields of fire. Every aircraft that breaks becomes a lone target, and Ilfrey had speed and positioning. He had become the wolf inside the sheepfold. The Germans expected honor. Not in the chivalric, antiquated sense. Those illusions had died over Spain and Poland years before, but in the tactical sense. They expected American pilots to fight according to the principles taught at every fighter school in every air force in the world. Maintain energy, maintain position, maintain mutual support. Ilfrey was doing none of these things. He was hemorrhaging airspeed with every turn, burning altitude, isolating himself deeper inside a formation that could, theoretically, focus all its defensive fire on him and shred his aircraft in seconds. Theoretically. In practice, the human nervous system is not built for this kind of chaos. The German pilots were trained, experienced men, many of them veterans of campaigns in Russia, Africa, and the Mediterranean. They knew how to fight, but they had been trained to fight predictable threats. Doctrine gave them responses. If attacked from above, tighten the formation and increase defensive fire. If a fighter makes a pass, track it, anticipate its exit vector, position for counterattack. Every scenario had a counter-scenario. Every move had a counter-move. Ilfrey was playing a different game. He wasn't exiting. He was staying, turning inside their decision loops, moving faster than their training could accommodate. And every second they spent trying to understand what he was doing was a second he used to kill another one of them. The third kill was a snapshot, a deflection burst at a Bf-110 trying to dive away. Ilfrey's cannon shells tore through the cockpit, killed the pilot instantly, left the aircraft to auger into the Bavarian countryside 8 miles below. The fourth came as he reversed his turn, bleeding more speed, but gaining position on a WWII that had frozen in place, its pilot paralyzed by indecision. Ilfrey fired from dead astern, the easiest shot in aerial combat, and the bomber disintegrated in a fireball that rocked his Lightning even at 100 yards distance. By now, the formation had collapsed entirely. Aircraft scattered in every direction, defensive discipline abandoned in favor of raw survival instinct. And still Ilfrey hunted. His airspeed had dropped below 200 miles per hour, dangerously slow for this altitude, close to stall speed with the maneuvering he was doing. His ammunition counters were plummeting. His fuel was below half. Everything about his tactical situation screamed disengage. He did not disengage. There is a moment in combat that transcends training, transcends doctrine, transcends even survival instinct. It is the moment when a predator realizes it is utterly dominant, when the calculus of risk evaporates, when the only thing that matters is the purity of the act itself. Luftwaffe aces had experienced this over Poland and France in the early war years, when their Bf-109s carved through obsolete French moraine saulniers and British ferry battles like scythes through wheat. Now, in the spring of 1944, an American pilot was experiencing it over Germany. The fifth kill was a Bf-110 that made the mistake of trying to run. Ilfrey chased it for 30 seconds, closing the distance despite his low airspeed, until he was close enough to see the rear gunner frantically traversing his twin machine guns. He fired. The gunner's position exploded. The Bf-110 rolled inverted and fell away, smoking. The sixth came as he finally, reluctantly, began his disengagement. A lone WWII, separated from the others, flying straight and level in what must have been shock or confusion. Ilfrey had perhaps 3 seconds of ammunition left. He closed to point-blank range, fired, watched the bomber's starboard engine erupt in flames, and then finally, after nearly 4 minutes inside the formation, he pulled out. He dove for the deck, engines screaming, the Lightning's airframe groaning under the stress. Behind him, the remnants of the German formation limped eastward, their radio frequencies a chaos of recrimination and disbelief. 6 aircraft, 4 minutes, 1 pilot. When Ilfrey landed at his base in England 90 minutes later, his crew chief counted the bullet holes in his airframe. 14 hits, none critical, several of them close enough to the cockpit that it was a miracle he hadn't taken shrapnel. The gun camera footage was rushed to intelligence officers, who watched it in silence, then watched it again, then sent it up the chain of command with a note that simply read, "This shouldn't be possible." But it was possible, and the reason it was possible had everything to do with the nation that built the P-38 and the man who flew it. The Lockheed Lightning was a product of American industrial abundance, over 10,000 built by war's end, each one requiring 25,000 man-hours of labor, each one a symphony of aluminum alloy, hydraulic lines, electrical systems, and turbo superchargers. It was not the most elegant fighter of the war, nor the most agile. But it was robust. It could absorb damage that would down a Bf-109. It could fly farther than a Spitfire. It could carry more ammunition than a FW-190. It was, in every sense, a fighter built by a nation that did not have to choose between quality and quantity, because it could afford both. Ilfrey, in turn, was a product of American tactical flexibility. Unlike Luftwaffe pilots, who were drilled relentlessly in formation discipline and adherence to doctrine, American pilots were encouraged, within limits, to adapt, to innovate, to take initiative. The culture that produced the P-38 also produced a training environment where a pilot could, if he showed the skill and the results, bend the rules. Not break them entirely, but bend them far enough that something new emerged. The Germans had expected American pilots to fight like Americans were supposed to fight, collectively, cautiously, by the book. What they got instead was a Texan who fought like he was born to it, who understood instinctively that rules were tools, not chains, and who wielded his aircraft the way a Renaissance duelist wielded a rapier, not with brute force, but with precision, timing, and an absolute refusal to concede the initiative. In the days after the April 5 engagement, Luftwaffe intelligence officers compiled reports from the surviving pilots. The accounts were fragmentary, contradictory, marked by the fog of combat and the unreliability of traumatized memory. But certain details recurred. The American pilot had come through the formation, not around it. He had stayed inside the defensive perimeter for an impossible length of time. He had killed with surgical precision, even while maneuvering in ways that should have stalled his aircraft or torn it apart. And he had done it alone. One Bf-110 pilot, a veteran of 3 years combat, was quoted in the after-action report as saying, "It was as if he did not care whether he lived or died. But he flew with absolute control." I do not understand how both can be true. This was the paradox that the Luftwaffe could not resolve. The Americans were supposed to be cautious, methodical, reliant on material superiority and safety in numbers. Yet here was a pilot who flew with the reckless aggression of a Stuka pilot over Poland, combined with the cold calculation of a veteran ace. It was not supposed to be possible. The American system was not supposed to produce this kind of warrior. But it had, and Ilfrey was not unique. Across the European theater, American pilots were learning, adapting, evolving. The early losses, the bombers shot down over Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the fighters outmaneuvered over the Channel, had been the tuition paid for a brutal education. By 1944, the students had graduated. They flew aircraft that could outrange, outclimb, and outlast anything the Luftwaffe fielded. They came from a nation that could replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. And increasingly, they flew with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, because they had learned that the German mystique, the myth of the invincible expert, the superior Aryan warrior, was just that, a myth. There is a recording preserved in the archives of the U.S. Air Force Historical Research Agency of a radio intercept from April 5, 1944. The quality is poor, the voice is distorted by static, and the limitations of 1940's recording technology. But you can hear it if you listen closely. The German voice, tight with panic, saying, kommt zurück durch die Formation. He's coming back through the formation. And then, 15 seconds later, a different voice. Calmer, resigned. Ist überall. He is everywhere. This was the psychological shift that no amount of tactical training could address. The Luftwaffe had been built on the principle of the individual ace, the lone hunter, the knight of the sky. Their top pilots, Hartmann, Barkhorn, Rahl, racked up kill counts in the hundreds, each one a testament to personal skill and ruthless efficiency. But by 1944, the Luftwaffe was running out of aces. They were dying over the Reich, over France, over the Eastern Front, faster than the training schools could replace them. And the replacement pilots, hastily trained, flying obsolete aircraft with dwindling fuel reserves, found themselves facing an American air armada that combined individual skill with systemic superiority. Ilfrey's engagement on April 5 was not an anomaly. It was a symbol. It was proof that the American way of war, flexible, adaptive, grounded in material abundance and decentralized decision-making, could produce outcomes that rivaled or exceeded the German cult of the ace. The Luftwaffe had built its identity on the Superman. America built its air force on the assembly line, and then trusted the men who flew those mass-produced fighters to become supermen if the situation demanded it. The P-38 itself became a kind of totem in this equation. Its silhouette, those twin booms, that central nacelle, was unmistakable. German soldiers on the ground called it the Gabelschwanz-Teufel, the fork-tailed devil, and the name carried a weight of dread. It wasn't the most feared aircraft in the Allied arsenal. That honor probably belonged to the P-51 or the British Mosquito, but it had a presence, a psychological heft that transcended its technical specifications. When a P-38 appeared on the horizon, it signified reach. It meant the Americans could strike anywhere, anytime, with aircraft that had flown hundreds of miles from their bases and still had fuel to fight, to hunt, to kill. In the aftermath of Ilfrey's six-kill mission, the P-38's reputation solidified further. Intelligence reports from German units began noting increased radio chatter whenever lightnings were spotted, a heightened level of alert that wasn't present for other Allied fighters. Part of this was rational. P-38s often escorted heavy bombers, so their presence meant a major raid was inbound. But part of it was emotional. The P-38 had become associated with a particular kind of American aggression, a willingness to press attacks beyond the point of reason, to take risks that defied calculation. This was the abundance the Germans could not match. Not just the abundance of aircraft, though that was real and crushing, but the abundance of audacity. American pilots, by 1944, knew they could afford to take risks. If they were shot down, there was another pilot behind them and another aircraft on the production line. If they expended all their ammunition in a single furious engagement, the armories back in England had millions of rounds stockpiled. The war of attrition, which Germany had inflicted on Russia and which Russia was now inflicting back, was being waged in the skies over the Reich with the same merciless logic. And America, with its intact industrial base and bottomless reserves, was winning. Ilfrey's gun camera footage was eventually declassified and shown at training sessions for new fighter pilots. The instructors would pause the film at key moments, pointing out the angles, the lead calculations, the snap decisions. But they always struggled to explain the core of it, the decision to stay inside the formation, to keep turning, to keep killing when every instinct and every page of the manual said to disengage. One instructor, a former P-47 pilot with 8 kills to his name, was recorded in a 1945 training session saying, "What Lieutenant Ilfrey did that day was not something we can teach. We can teach you to fly. We can teach you to shoot. But we cannot teach you to be willing to die in the act of killing. Either you have that or you don't." This was the unspoken truth at the heart of aerial combat. Training created competence. Experience created skill. But the willingness to push past survival instinct into something colder and more absolute, that was a quality that could not be manufactured. The Luftwaffe had relied on this quality in its aces, had built an entire tactical philosophy around it. But by 1944, American pilots were demonstrating it with increasing frequency, and they had the material backing to make it devastating. The transformation was evident in the kill ratios. In 1943, Luftwaffe fighters had maintained approximate parity with their Allied counterparts in one-on-one engagements. By mid-1944, the ratios had shifted dramatically. American fighters were downing German aircraft at rates of 3-1, sometimes 5-1. Part of this was the degradation of German pilot quality, as experienced flyers were killed and replaced by undertrained novices. But part of it was the emergence of a cadre of American pilots who had learned to fight with the cold efficiency that the Germans had once monopolized. Ilfrey flew 46 more combat missions after April 5, 1944. He added 3 more confirmed kills to his tally before his tour ended. He survived the war, returned to Texas, and spent the next 40 years refusing most interview requests. In the few conversations he did grant, he was characteristically terse about the engagement over Bavaria. "I saw an opportunity," he said in a 1978 interview. "I took it." That's all, but it wasn't all. It was a microcosm of the entire American war effort, pragmatic, ruthless, grounded in material reality, but executed with an individualism that no totalitarian system could replicate. The Germans had built an air force around the mythology of the knight, the ace, the superior warrior. The Americans had built an air force around the assembly line, the training manual, and the assumption that average men, given the right tools and the right training, could become exceptional when the moment demanded it. The wreckage of the 6 German aircraft fell across a 20-mile stretch of Bavarian countryside. Farmers who witnessed the engagement later reported that the sky had seemed to rain fire, that the sound of the P-38's engines had echoed off the mountains like the growl of some ancient, angry god. One of the Bf-110s crashed into a forest, igniting a wildfire that burned for 3 days. Another augured into a field, creating a crater that remained visible for decades afterward, a scar in the earth that local children would dare each other to approach. In the archives of the Luftwaffe, the after-action reports from that day were filed away with thousands of others, a single data point in the vast calculus of industrial-age warfare. But among the surviving pilots, the story spread. The American who stayed inside the formation. The lightning that killed 6 in 4 minutes. The voice on the radio, edged with terror, "He's coming back through the formation." It became a kind of ghost story, a cautionary tale told in officers' messes and crew rooms across the shrinking Reich. And in those stories, in that fear, was the recognition of a deeper truth. The war was lost, not because of this engagement or that battle, but because the nation they fought had become something they could not match. America had entered the war late, unprepared, with aircraft that were often inferior and pilots who lacked combat experience. But it had learned. It had adapted. And now, in the spring of 1944, it was demonstrating a mastery of industrial warfare that left no room for chivalry, no space for mythology, no hope for anything but survival. The P-38 that Jack Ilfrey flew that day was eventually retired from service, its airframe hours exhausted, its systems worn beyond economical repair. It was scrapped sometime in 1946, melted down and reformed into the aluminum components of refrigerators, automobiles, the mundane infrastructure of peacetime prosperity. But the gun camera footage remained, and the radio intercept, and the after-action reports. Fragments of a moment when one man in one aircraft demonstrated that the American way of war, pragmatic, flexible, relentless, could produce outcomes that rivaled any warrior mythology the enemy cared to invoke. In the end, it wasn't the technology alone that won the air war over Europe. The P-38 was a fine aircraft, but it wasn't decisively superior to the Bf-109 or the FW-190 in most metrics. What won was the system that produced the aircraft, the culture that trained the pilots, and the philosophy that allowed men like Ilfrey to take a textbook, tear out the pages, and write their own in blood and fire at 30,000 feet. The Germans had expected Americans to fight like a democracy, cautiously, collectively, constrained by committees and doctrine. What they encountered instead was a democracy that had learned to unleash individual initiative within a framework of overwhelming material support. It was the worst of both worlds for the Luftwaffe, the discipline and resources of a centralized industrial power combined with the adaptability and aggression of individual warriors. On April 5, 1944, over the Bavarian Alps, that combination manifested in 4 minutes of sustained violence that left 6 German aircraft burning and a radio frequency echoing with panic. And in the years that followed, as the Reich crumbled and the Luftwaffe dissolved into scattered remnants, the lesson of that engagement was repeated 1,000 times over. The fork-tailed devil was not just an aircraft. It was a promise, a demonstration, a proof of concept. America had learned to fight, and it had learned to win. The sky above Bavaria is silent now, the contrails long since faded, the wreckage reclaimed by rust and earth. But the recording remains, archived in a temperature-controlled vault in Alabama, a fragment of sound preserved across 80 years. If you listen closely, through the static and the distortion, you can still hear it. The German voice, tight with fear, speaking the words that defined a moment and a war. Kommt zurück durch die Formation. He's coming back through the formation. And in those words, an empire began to understand that it had already lost.